They fired her in the middle of this blizzard.
Fired? Who?
The intern. She was our only hope.
This can't be happening, please.
We have to find her.
A massive blizzard hammered the Chicago hospital. Inside Trauma Room 1, the heart monitor let out a single deafening, endless beep. Flat line. Dr. Vance, the untouchable chief of medicine, dropped to his knees. His solid gold Rolex smashed against the tiles as he screamed his 7-year-old daughter's name. Pure, helpless panic. But standing quietly by the glass doors was Maya, a nameless intern in faded, oversized scrubs. She held the only vial of antidote that could save the little girl. She did not speak. She just turned her back, pushed the doors open, and walked away. But to understand how we got here, let me take you back to the start of that brutal winter morning at Chicago Memorial Hospital. Chicago Memorial was a fortress of glass and steel. At 6 in the morning, the wind whipping off Lake Michigan was brutal. It was the kind of freezing air that made your lungs ache and your eyes water. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the absolute freeze of the hierarchy inside those walls. You need to understand how a place like this operates. It is not just a place of healing. It is a kingdom. And every kingdom has a king. A sleek black Mercedes S-Class rolled up to the VIP valet entrance. The heavy tires crushed the thin layer of morning ice.
They fired her in the middle of this blizzard.
Fired? Who?
The intern. She was our only hope.
This can't be happening, please.
We have to find
Dr.
her.
Vance stepped out into the freezing wind. He did not say thank you. He did not even look at the kid. Vance was the chief of medicine. He was 52 years old, with silver hair, perfectly swept back, wearing a tailored Italian cashmere overcoat over a bespoke charcoal suit. Underneath the crisp cuff of his white shirt, a solid gold Rolex Daytona caught the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital overhang. He walked through the sliding glass doors, and the atmosphere of the entire lobby immediately shifted. Nurses behind the reception desk straightened their spines. Junior doctors stopped talking mid-sentence and pressed themselves against the walls to give him a wide berth. Everyone nodded. Everyone deferred. He was medical royalty, third-generation Harvard legacy. His surgical hands were insured for $2 million. He did not just walk down the corridors, he inspected them. If a janitor was mopping, they stopped and backed away. If an elevator was full, people stepped out so he could ride alone. He wore his arrogance like a second skin, comfortable to him and suffocating to everyone else. When he reached the executive surgical wing, he slipped his arms into a pristine, blindingly white lab coat. His name, Dr. Richard Vance, Chief of Surgery, was embroidered in heavy gold thread over his heart. He looked exactly like a man who held life and death in his palms, and he knew it. He adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the glass doors, admiring his own pristine image, before stepping onto the surgical floor. He demanded perfection, but more than that, he demanded absolute submission. At the exact same moment, on the opposite side of the hospital, down by the loading docks and the overflowing medical waste dumpsters, a heavy city bus groaned to a halt. The hydraulic doors hissed open, spitting a thick cloud of exhaust into the freezing air. Maya stepped down onto the slush-covered pavement. She did not wear cashmere. She wore a thin navy blue nylon windbreaker over a set of faded green hospital scrubs. The scrubs were pilling at the seams, washed so many times they had lost their original shape. She walked toward the employee service entrance, her cheap canvas sneakers squeaking faintly on the wet, salted asphalt, The security guard at the metal detector did not look up from his phone when she walked in. She badged through the turnstile. The scanner let out a dull, flat beep. Maya was an intern, but in the ruthless, status-obsessed ecosystem of Chicago Memorial, she was worse than an intern. She was a ghost. Her personnel file noted that she transferred in from an underfunded state medical program in a town nobody had ever heard of. She was buried in student debt, living in a cramped studio apartment with a radiator that barely worked. She woke up at 4 in the morning every single day just to catch the first bus out of the city's south side. She had no medical legacy, no wealthy parents to fund a research wing, no letters of recommendation from famous surgeons. Just a quiet, exhausted girl who kept her eyes pinned to the floor. She did not wear makeup. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, practical bun, secured with a cheap plastic clip. She carried a thick, leather-bound notebook pressed tightly against her chest. The edges were frayed, and the failing binding was held together by a strip of black duct tape. The pages inside were swollen with thousands of handwritten clinical notes, complex anatomical sketches, and chemical formulas. She walked down the dim, flickering basement hallway toward the crowded resident locker room. No one greeted her. 2 senior surgical residents brushed past her, knocking her shoulder hard against the concrete wall without even glancing back to apologize. They were too busy discussing their upcoming ski trips to Aspen and their elite neurosurgery placements to notice the intern they just shoved into the drywall. Maya simply absorbed the impact. She did not complain. She did not demand an apology. She just tightened her grip on her taped notebook, steadied her breathing, and kept moving forward. In this hospital hierarchy, if Dr. Vance was the untouchable king, seated on a throne of gold thread and Rolex watches, Maya was the dirt beneath the floorboards. And the elite residents made absolutely sure she never forgot her place. They looked right through her, assuming the faded scrubs meant a faded mind. They had no idea who she really was. By 7:15 in the morning, the surgical lounge was already buzzing. It smelled of freshly roasted espresso beans and designer cologne. A dozen top-tier surgical residents gathered around a massive mahogany table. They were loud. They were comparing weekend ski trips to Aspen and bragging about upcoming neurosurgery placements. They all wore blindingly white coats. Their stethoscopes were draped around their necks like heavy silver jewelry. And then there was Maya. She was not reviewing complex patient charts. She was standing in the far corner, pushed back against the wall next to the kitchenette. She was making coffee. That was the unwritten rule Dr. Vance established for her on her very first day. He had stood in front of the department and declared she lacked the intellectual pedigree for medical rounds. Her primary clinical duty, he announced, was to keep the coffee pot full. So she stood silently. She watched the steaming liquid drip into the glass carafe. She poured a large measure into a heavy ceramic mug. She added 2 packets of raw sugar just the way he demanded. She placed the mug at the head of the table, smoothing a paper coaster underneath it. Then she stepped into the shadows. The heavy double doors swung open. The laughter died instantly. The residents scrambled to take their seats, sitting up straight like soldiers. Vance walked in. He did not say good morning. He tossed a thick stack of patient files onto the table with a sharp slap. He sat down. Maya retreated further back, standing completely still near the trash cans. Vance reached out. He picked up the ceramic mug. He did not look at Maya. He brought the rim to his lips and took a slow sip. Nobody breathed. He held the coffee in his mouth for exactly 2 seconds. Then he spat it right back into the mug. The sound was wet and sharp. He slammed the mug down. Hot, dark coffee sloshed over the rim, staining the polished wood and dripping onto the floor. Vance turned his head slowly. His eyes locked onto Maya. His gaze was pure ice. "What is this?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. Maya kept her eyes trained on his chin, a classic tactic for calming the situation down. "It is dark roast, Dr. Vance," she said quietly, "with 2 sugars. Vance stood up. He looked around the table. A few elite residents were already smirking, eager to watch the execution. I asked what this is. Vance repeated, his voice dripping with venom, "Because it certainly is not fit for human consumption." He took a step toward her. "It is lukewarm. It is bitter. It tastes exactly like failure." He reached out and pushed the ceramic mug. He pushed it intentionally. It tipped over completely. A tidal wave of hot coffee cascaded off the edge and splattered directly onto Maya's faded canvas sneakers. The scalding liquid soaked through the thin fabric, burning her toes. She did not flinch. She did not take a step back. Her face remained blank. Vance leaned in close. She could smell the mint on his breath. "You are not here to practice medicine," he hissed. His words sliced through the room like a surgical blade. "You are here because administration forced a diversity quota down my throat. They made me take a charity case from a pathetic, no-name medical school to make their brochures look good. Your only job, your singular responsibility in my department is to pour water and fetch coffee. And you cannot even manage to do that right." He pulled a pristine silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, wiped a single drop of coffee from his thumb, and dropped the silk rag into the steaming puddle on the floor. "Clean it up," he ordered. "Do not make a single sound while I teach the real doctors in this room." Maya did not hesitate. She walked to the supply closet, pulled out paper towels, dropped to her knees on the cold linoleum floor in front of a dozen smirking elites, and began to wipe up his mess. By 10 o'clock, the atmosphere shifted completely from the resident lounge to operating room 4. This was not just a surgery. This was a performance. The surgical theater was a massive sterile dome. The observation gallery up above was packed shoulder to shoulder with medical students. Their faces were pressed against the thick glass, eager to watch the master at work. Down on the floor, the bright overhead surgical lights eliminated every single shadow, turning the operating table into a glowing white stage. And Vance loved the stage. He was scrubbed in his hands, encased in sterile latex. The elite residents were gathered tightly around the table, standing in prime positions, holding retractors and suction tubes. The patient's chest was open. The rhythmic mechanical hiss of the ventilator filled the room, punctuated by the steady high-pitched beeping of the heart monitor. Where was Maya? She was not at the table. She was not even close to the sterile field. Vance had ordered her to stand by the rear wall, right next to the red biohazard disposal bins, completely out of the way. Vance worked with a terrifying speed. He was arrogant, but his hands were undeniable. As he operated, he played a game. In elite surgery, they call it pimping. It is a psychological blood sport where the attending surgeon fires rapid, incredibly obscure medical questions at the junior doctors while the patient is actively bleeding. The goal is simple. See who cracks under the pressure. See who breaks. Vance fired a question at Sterling, the golden boy resident from Harvard. Patient presents with acute hyperkalemia and a widened QRS complex. First line treatment. Go. Sterling did not miss a beat. Intravenous calcium gluconate to stabilize the myocardium, followed by insulin and glucose to drive potassium intracellularly. Vance nodded behind his surgical mask. Good. Very good, Sterling. That is why your father pays the Ivy League tuition. Vance tied off a bleeder. He did not look up from the open chest cavity. He just projected his voice toward the back of the room, targeting the biohazard bins. Let us see if the charity case knows anything besides how to ruin a dark roast. Hey, coffee girl, listen closely. Maya looked up from her notebook. She closed the taped cover and stepped half a pace forward from the wall. Yes, Dr. Vance. Vance held out his hand. The scrub nurse slapped a fresh scalpel into his palm. A 30-year-old patient presents with sudden onset pulmonary edema and dramatically elevated troponin levels. The emergency room thinks it is a massive heart attack, but the coronary angiogram shows absolutely pristine arteries, 0 blockages, no history of drug use, no structural defects. What is the diagnosis? The residents around the table froze. They exchanged nervous glances above their blue masks. The medical students up in the gallery leaned closer to the glass. It was a brutal trick question, a zebra, a clinical scenario so incredibly rare it was barely a footnote in their advanced textbooks. Vance was intentionally trying to humiliate her on the biggest stage in the hospital. He wanted her to stutter. He wanted her to guess and fail so he could destroy her in front of an audience. Maya stood perfectly still against the cold green tiles. Her voice was steady, quiet, but it cut through the mechanical hum of the machines like a knife. Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, she said. The room went dead silent. The hissing of the ventilator seemed to echo. Maya did not stop there. She delivered the clinical breakdown with robotic precision, also known as broken heart syndrome. It is a stress-induced cardiomyopathy, often triggered by severe emotional trauma or sudden catecholamine surges. The apex of the left ventricle balloons out, causing severe systolic dysfunction that perfectly mimics a massive myocardial infarction, which explains the elevated troponin and the edema. Despite the coronary arteries being completely clear of plaque, nobody moved. Sterling stared at her, his eyes wide above his mask. The scrub nurses looked at each other in shock. The students up in the gallery started whispering frantically. It was not just the correct answer. It was a flawless textbook, perfect, undeniable answer. At the operating table, Vance's hand stopped moving. Just for a fraction of a second. The scalpel hovered over the aorta. Behind his mask, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ground together. He despised being upstaged. He despised it even more when it came from someone he deemed beneath his contempt. He did not acknowledge that she was right. He did not offer a single word of praise or encouragement. Instead, he slowly turned his head. He glared at her over his shoulder, his eyes burning with a toxic mixture of embarrassment and rage. "Did I ask you to recite a Wikipedia article to my operating room?" he hissed. His voice was laced with pure poison. "You are breathing my sterile air. Step back. Keep your back pressed flat against those tiles. Keep your mouth shut. And do not ever interrupt the real doctors while we are saving lives." Maya did not show a single ounce of anger. Her face remained a mask of perfect professional submission. She nodded once. "Yes, doctor." She took 3 slow steps backward. Her shoulder blades hit the cold, hard tiles of the rear wall. She opened her frayed leather notebook. She clicked her cheap plastic pen, and she went back to writing. She faded right back into the background, invisible again, unnoticed, ignored. Every single highly educated elite doctor in that room looked right past her, assuming she was nothing more than a slow, uneducated intern taking up space. They judged her by the faded scrubs, the cheap shoes, and the silence. They had absolutely no idea who was really standing against that wall. They had no idea what kind of mind was hiding behind that quiet face. And they had no idea that in just a few short hours, the entire hospital was going to crash down around them, and the ghost in the corner was going to be the only thing standing between the king of medicine and a body bag. Outside the hospital, the temperature plummeted. The blizzard was no longer just snow, it was a whiteout. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of Chicago, freezing everything it touched. Then a sound cut through the storm, a siren, high-pitched, frantic. It was not slowing down for intersections. It was not waiting for the ice to clear. A massive red and white city ambulance barreled down the avenue. The tires skidded on the black ice, fighting for traction. The heavy vehicle drifted sideways before the driver wrenched the wheel, correcting the spin. He slammed his foot on the gas. He was not just driving. He was fighting the clock. The ambulance slammed to a halt in the emergency drop-off bay. The heavy tires hopped the concrete curb. Before the vehicle even fully stopped, the back doors were kicked open. The freezing wind rushed into the cabin. 2 paramedics jumped out into the slush. They grabbed the handles of the gurney and pulled. The metal legs snapped into place. They hit the ground running. They did not walk. They sprinted toward the sliding glass doors. The doors did not open fast enough. The lead paramedic slammed his shoulder into the glass, forcing it off the track. The cold air rushed into the warm lobby, but nobody noticed the cold. They only noticed the screaming. Incoming, the paramedic yelled at the top of his lungs, "We need trauma room 1 open right now. Out of the way. Move." Nurses scrambled. Gurneys were shoved against the walls. The emergency room parted like the Red Sea. In the center of the chaos, lying on the adult-sized stretcher, was a tiny figure, a 7-year-old girl. She was wearing a pink winter coat, but it was cut open. Her name was Chloe. She was Dr. Richard Vance's daughter, and she was dying. She was seizing violently. Her small body arched off the thin mattress, rigid and shaking. The paramedic was straddling the moving gurney, holding an oxygen mask tightly over her face. But it was not working. Her lips were a dark, terrifying shade of blue. Her skin was the color of wet ash. The portable heart monitor attached to the foot of the bed was shrieking. The red numbers on the screen were plummeting. Heart rate 140, 120, 90, dropping fast, blood pressure bottoming out. She was suffocating in plain sight, and nobody knew why. 4 floors up, in the sterile scrub room, Vance was washing his hands. He was turning off the brass faucet, admiring the reflection of his own steady hands in the mirror. He had just humiliated a ghost. He felt like a god. Then his heavy gold Rolex vibrated against his wrist. He ignored it. Seconds later, the emergency intercom on the wall crackled to life. It was not a standard page. It was a code red override. The voice of the charge nurse echoed through the room, stripped of its usual professional calm. Her voice was shaking. Dr. Vance? Code red. Trauma 1. It is your daughter. Vance froze. The paper towel slipped from his hands. For 1 second, the king of medicine could not compute the words. Then the reality shattered his perfect world. He did not walk. He did not jog. He bolted. He burst through the double doors of the surgical suite. He did not care about the sterile field. He did not care about protocol. He shoved a senior attending doctor entirely out of his way. Out of my way, he screamed. It was not a professional command. It was a guttural, terrifying roar. He sprinted down the hallway. His expensive Italian leather shoes lost traction on the freshly waxed linoleum. He slipped his knee, slamming hard into the floor, tearing the fabric of his trousers. He did not even feel it. He scrambled back to his feet like a desperate animal. He threw himself into the stairwell. He vaulted down the concrete steps, taking them 3 at a time. His lungs burned. His perfectly swept silver hair fell wildly across his face. The untouchable surgeon was gone. He was just a terrified father running out of time. He crashed through the doors of the emergency department. He saw the flashing red lights of Trauma Room 1. He shoved through the crowd of white coats. He reached the center of the room and looked down. Chloe was convulsing. The blue tint was spreading across her cheeks. The heart monitor let out a long, high-pitched wail. Vance grabbed his own hair. He dropped to his knees right there on the bloody floor. He screamed her name. The power, the money, the arrogance. It all meant absolutely nothing. He was the most powerful doctor in the city, and he was completely powerless. Trauma Room 1 descended into pure, concentrated chaos. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood and the sharp chemical bite of iodine. The top medical minds in the hospital flooded through the glass doors. The elite doctors, the Ivy League residents, the specialists Vance had personally handpicked. They surrounded the bed. They shouted over the piercing shrieks of the heart monitor. Blood pressure 60/40. Oxygen saturation 82% and dropping. Vance stood at the head of the bed. He was hyperventilating. The untouchable surgeon was gone. He grabbed a penlight and flashed it into Chloe's eyes. Her pupils were dilated, unresponsive. He looked at the rash spreading aggressively across her neck. It was bright red, raised and moving fast. He barked an order. Anaphylaxis. It is acute anaphylaxis. Push 0.3 milligrams of epinephrine intramuscularly. Now, push antihistamines. Push steroids. Do it now. The residents moved like a military unit. They ripped open plastic packaging. They drew up the clear fluids into large plastic syringes. The room operated on blind obedience. The king had made his diagnosis. Nobody questioned it. Nobody stopped to think. They just moved to execute his orders. But tucked away in the back corner of the room, standing completely still against the stainless steel cabinets, was Maya. She was not panicking. She was not rushing. She was observing. Her dark eyes darted across the room, taking in every single detail the panicked elite doctors were missing. She looked at the red rash on Chloe's neck. It was not blotchy, like an allergic reaction. It was tracing the path of the major veins. She looked at the child's fingernails. They were not just blue from oxygen deprivation. There was a distinct, terrifying yellow tint at the cuticles. And then she noticed the smell. It was faint, almost entirely masked by the harsh scent of the medical alcohol and the sweat in the room. But it was there, a sweet, unmistakable scent, hovering right above the child's open mouth. Bitter almonds. Her eyes snapped down to the foot of the bed. The paramedics had hastily cut away Chloe's snow boots. Maya's gaze locked onto the child's right ankle. There it was, a tiny, almost invisible puncture wound. 2 microscopic pinpricks surrounded by a circle of necrotic blackened tissue. It was not an allergy. It was not a peanut or a bee sting. It was a neurotoxin, a highly specific, incredibly rare biological toxin. The resident named Sterling stepped forward. He held a massive syringe filled with epinephrine. He flicked the needle once, clearing the air bubble. He raised it, aiming straight for the thick muscle of Chloe's thigh. Maya's mind ran the chemical reaction in a fraction of a second. If they pushed epinephrine into a bloodstream flooded with that specific neurotoxin, the chemical interaction would cause immediate catastrophic cardiovascular collapse. The adrenaline would act as a catalyst. It would accelerate the toxin's binding process to the heart muscle. If that needle broke Chloe's skin, she would be dead in less than 30 seconds. The elite doctors were completely blind. The king of medicine was making the biggest mistake of his life, and he was taking his own daughter down with him. Sterling pressed the alcohol swab against the child's leg. He positioned the needle. The monitor shrieked louder, counting down the final seconds. Maya did not have time to speak. She did not have time to explain the chemical pathways or point out the necrotic tissue. The spring was fully compressed. She moved. Maya did not have time to speak. She did not have time to explain the complex chemical pathways or point out the necrotic tissue on the child's ankle. The spring was fully compressed. She moved. She pushed off the back wall. She did not walk gracefully. She lunged. Sterling had the syringe positioned perfectly over Chloe's thigh. His thumb was resting on the plunger, ready to inject the massive dose of epinephrine. The needle was a fraction of an inch from piercing the skin. "Stop!" Maya's voice was no longer quiet. It was a sharp, commanding crack that echoed off the tile walls. Before Sterling could even register the sound, Maya's hand shot out. She grabbed his wrist. She did not just tap him. She gripped his forearm with a shocking, desperate strength, her fingers digging into his scrub top. The momentum of her lunge knocked his arm completely off trajectory. The needle missed Chloe's leg by half an inch, embedding itself harmlessly into the sterile blue drape covering the mattress. The entire room froze. The mechanical hiss of the ventilator kept pumping. The heart monitor kept shrieking. But every single human being in Trauma Room 1 turned to look at the intern in the faded scrubs. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Sterling looked down at his wrist, completely stunned. He could not comprehend what had just happened. The coffee girl. the ghost from the basement. She had just physically assaulted a senior resident in the middle of a code red. She had just actively interfered with the chief of surgery's direct order. It was not just insubordination. In the rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of Chicago Memorial, it was professional suicide. Maya did not let go of his wrist. Her dark eyes snapped from Sterling to Dr. Vance. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. "That is not anaphylaxis," she said. Her voice was rapid fire, stripping away all the deference she had shown all morning. "Do not push the epi. If you push that adrenaline, it will accelerate the binding process. You will put her into immediate cardiovascular collapse. You will kill her right now." Vance stared at her. His perfectly tailored world was already collapsing around him, and now this nobody, this pathetic diversity hire, was standing over his dying daughters, telling him how to practice medicine. The shock on his face morphed instantly into a rage so pure it was terrifying. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not look at the puncture wound on the ankle. His ego was entirely blinding him. He stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "Get your filthy hands off my resident," Vance roared. The sound of his voice was so loud it made the nearest nurses flinch. But Maya did not move. She kept her grip on Sterling's arm, holding the needle away from the child. "Look at her neck." "Dr. Vance," Maya pleaded, her voice tight with desperation. "Look at the cuticle discoloration. It is a neurotoxin. She needs sodium nitrite, not epinephrine. If you do this, you cannot reverse it." Vance's face turned a dangerous shade of red. He was not listening to a single word about neurotoxins or cuticles. He only saw a subordinate challenging his absolute authority in front of his entire department. "Security!" Vance screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with panic and fury. "Get her out of my hospital." Two large hospital security guards, drawn by the initial commotion of the code red, burst through the glass doors. They did not hesitate. They lunged at Maya. One guard grabbed her right shoulder. The other seized her left arm. They ripped her away from the bed with brutal force. Her fingers were torn away from Sterling's wrist. The sudden violent motion sent her heavy duct-taped notebook crashing to the floor. The pages spilled open, scattering across the bloody linoleum. She fought back. For the first time all day, the quiet, submissive intern fought like a cornered animal. She planted her canvas sneakers on the floor, trying to break their hold. "Do not give her the shot." Maya screamed, her voice tearing at her throat as the guards dragged her backward toward the exit. "It is a toxin. Please, check the ankle. Check the ankle." Vance ignored her completely. He turned his back on her, focusing entirely on Sterling. "Push the epinephrine." Vance ordered, his voice trembling, but absolute. "Push it right now." The guards dragged Maya through the sliding glass doors. The heavy doors snapped shut behind her, cutting off her screams. The last thing she saw before she was pulled down the hallway was Sterling pulling the needle out of the mattress, repositioning it over Chloe's thigh, and pressing his thumb down on the plunger. The clear liquid vanished into the dying child's muscle. The heavy sliding glass doors of Trauma Room 1 snapped shut. They locked with a harsh electronic click. The glass was thick enough to muffle the frantic screaming inside. The chaotic shrieks of the monitor faded into a distant hum. Maya was standing alone in the sterile, brightly lit hallway. The two massive security guards released her arms. They gave her one last threatening glare before they turned and walked away. Maya did not move to fight them again. She did not bang her fists against the locked glass. She knew exactly what was happening on the other side of that door. She knew the exact chemical reaction taking place inside that little girl's veins at this very millisecond. Sterling had pushed the adrenaline. The trigger was pulled. The bullet was in flight. Dr. Vance had made his choice. He chose his ego over his daughter's survival. Maya stood perfectly still. The adrenaline of the physical struggle slowly drained from her system, leaving behind a cut-sharp clarity. Her chest heaved. Her faded green scrubs were pulled out of place. Her canvas sneakers left wet slush prints on the white linoleum floor. Her right knuckle was throbbing. During the violent scuffle with the security guards, her hand had scraped hard against the sharp metal edge of a cart. A jagged cut was sliced across her skin. Dark red blood was welling up, slowly dripping down her fingers. She did not reach for a bandage. She simply looked down at her hands. These were the hands that just tried to save a life, only to be swatted away like garbage. She reached up to her chest. Her fingers wrapped around the cheap plastic clip holding her hospital identification badge. The badge that labeled her a nobody. The badge that gave everyone in this building permission to treat her like dirt. She pulled it free. The plastic snapped. She held the badge for a second, looking at her own quiet face printed on the laminated card. Then she tossed it. It landed on a stainless steel surgical prep cart parked against the hallway wall. The plastic and metal collided. A sharp, distinct clatter echoed down the empty, silent corridor. She was no longer an intern at Chicago Memorial. Vance had fired her. He had banished her. But Maya was not just an intern. She was a scientist, and a scientist never leaves an equation unsolved. She reached deep into the pocket of her thin nylon windbreaker. Her fingers closed around a plastic ballpoint pen. She pulled it out. From her other pocket, she retrieved a small pad of yellow sticky notes. She stepped up to the stainless steel prep cart. She pressed the small yellow square flat against the cold metal surface. She clicked the pen. She did not hesitate. Her mind was a steel trap of toxicological data. She began to write. Her handwriting was sharp and forceful. She did not write a warning. She did not write an insult or a plea for them to listen. She wrote pure, undeniable science. She wrote the exact name of the obscure biological neurotoxin. She wrote the precise chemical composition of the required antidote. Sodium nitrite, 300 milligrams, intravenous push, followed immediately by sodium thiosulfate. She detailed the exact enzymatic binding process that would save the child's crashing heart. As her pen slashed across the paper, a single drop of blood from her torn knuckle fell. It landed right on the corner of the sticky note. The dark red blood absorbed into the cheap yellow paper, blooming outward, smearing the edge of her final word, a permanent visceral signature, a mark of the violence they had just inflicted upon her. She finished. She clicked the pen closed. She took the blood-stained yellow note and slipped it carefully underneath a heavy stainless steel kidney tray on the top shelf of the cart. She positioned it perfectly. hidden from a casual glance but impossible to miss for anyone looking for surgical tools. She left the answer right there in the hallway. Maya stepped back. She did not look through the glass doors of the trauma room. She did not care to watch the arrogant king of medicine realize his fatal mistake. She turned her back on the kingdom that had humiliated her. She walked down the long fluorescent hallway. She pushed open the emergency exit doors. The freezing wind of the blizzard swallowed her. She stepped into the blinding storm. The heavy metal doors slammed shut behind her. The ghost was gone. Inside Trauma Room 1, the pace slowed down to a suffocating crawl. The frantic high-speed energy of the resuscitation effort drained out of the room, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The monitor above the bed stopped shrieking its erratic, panicked alarm. Instead, it emitted a single, solid, endless tone. Flatline. The bright red line on the digital screen ran perfectly horizontal across the grid. Chloe's heart had stopped. The massive dose of epinephrine pushed by the elite resident on the direct orders of the chief of surgery had acted exactly as Maya predicted. It bound the neurotoxin directly to the cardiac tissue, causing instant catastrophic cardiovascular collapse. Sterling pulled the empty syringe back. His hand was shaking violently. He stared down at the child's blue lips. He looked over at the flatlining monitor. He could not process it. The smartest minds in the hospital had just killed a 7-year-old girl. Vance did not scream this time. He did not issue any orders. He simply collapsed. The untouchable king of medicine. The man whose hands were insured for millions dropped to his knees on the bloody linoleum. He grabbed the stainless steel side rail of the hospital bed, resting his forehead against the cold metal. A guttural, agonizing sob tore out of his throat. It was the sound of a man completely broken. His arrogance, his money, his power, none of it could buy back the heartbeat he had just silenced. The room stood frozen in a devastating, silent tragedy. A senior scrub nurse, her eyes wide with shock and grief, took a step backward to give the devastated father space. As her heel moved, she bumped hard against the stainless steel surgical prep cart parked near the door. The metal tray on the top shelf rattled loudly in the quiet room. A sharp, metallic clatter echoed over the flat-lining hum. The impact jarred the cart just enough. The small yellow sticky note previously hidden underneath the kidney tray slid out. It fluttered down like a dead leaf, landing face up on the floor right next to the pool of bloody water near Vance's knees. The nurse looked down. She saw the bright yellow paper. She saw the dark, smeared thumbprint of fresh blood on the corner. She knelt slowly and picked it up. She expected a meaningless note, a piece of trash. But as her eyes scanned the sharp, forceful handwriting, her breath caught in her throat. "Dr. Vance," she whispered. Her voice was trembling. "Dr. Vance, look at this." He did not move. He kept his face buried against the metal rail, weeping over his dead child. The nurse did not wait for him. She stood up, holding the blood-stained note, and she read it out loud. Her voice cut through the silence, clear and undeniable. "The patient is suffering from acute toxicity of a rare cyanogenic glycoside. Neurotoxin," she read, stumbling slightly over the complex terminology, but pushing through. The presentation perfectly mimics anaphylaxis, but the cutaneous erythema follows the venous pathways, and the cuticle beds display stage 1 jaundice. Do not push epinephrine. It will act as a catalyst for complete myocardial failure. Sterling's head snapped up. His eyes widened in absolute horror as the nurse read the exact physiological reaction he had just caused. The nurse swallowed hard, her eyes tracing the next lines on the yellow paper. Required antidote sodium nitrite, 300 milligrams, intravenous push immediately, followed by a slow drip of sodium thiosulfate to induce methemoglobinemia and detach the cyanide ions from the cytochrome oxidase. She stopped reading. The entire room stared at the small piece of paper in her hand. It was not a guess. It was not a panicked theory. It was a flawless, hyperspecific biochemical breakdown of the exact poison killing the child, complete with the precise milligram, perfect antidote required to save her. Sterling stared at the bloody note, and then he looked toward the sliding glass doors. The doors where security had dragged away the girl in the faded scrubs just 2 minutes ago. The intern he had shoved in the hallway. The girl whose coffee Vance had poured onto her shoes. Who wrote that? Vance finally choked out, raising his head. His eyes were red, his face streaked with tears and sweat. Who put that there? The nurse looked down at the bottom of the note. The blood smear covered part of it, but a small signature remained. A single, quickly scribbled initial. M. It was her. Sterling whispered, his voice cracking with the realization. The intern. She told you, Dr. Vance. She stood right there and told you it was a neurotoxin. She tried to stop me from pushing the epi. She knew. She knew exactly what it was. The name hung in the sterile air like a death sentence. Maya. The ghost in the faded scrubs. Vance stared at the bloody sticky note trembling in the nurse's hand. His mind simply could not process the information. He was the chief of surgery. He had just spent the entire morning treating this girl like absolute garbage, pouring hot coffee on her shoes, humiliating her in the surgical theater, and physically throwing her out of his emergency room. And she was the only person on earth who knew how to save his little girl. Before Vance could even open his mouth, a massive sound shattered the silence. The heavy electronic sliding glass doors of Trauma Room 1 were violently forced apart. They hit the door frames with a deafening crack. 3 men in sharp-tailored business suits burst into the room. They were not doctors. Leading the pack was Arthur Harris, the chief executive officer of Chicago Memorial Hospital. Behind him were 2 senior members of the board of directors. Their faces were pale. They were sweating heavily, completely ignoring the sterile field, the blood on the floor, and the flatlining monitor. They were not looking at the dying child. They were scanning the room with absolute, unadulterated panic. Harris stepped forward, his polished Oxford slipping on the wet linoleum. His eyes darted down to Vance, who was still kneeling on the floor. "Where is she?" Harris demanded. His voice was an explosion. It echoed off the tile walls thick with terror. "Where is the intern?" Vance looked up. His silver hair was a mess. "Arthur," he choked out, his voice cracking. "My daughter is dying. We need a crash cart." "I do not care about your ego right now," Richard Harris roared, his face turning a dark shade of crimson. He stepped right up to the kneeling surgeon. "I just got a call from the director of global health. Where is the woman in the green scrubs?" "The security desk said you ordered her physically removed from the premises. Tell me you did not throw her out into a blizzard." Vance blinked, totally disoriented. "She was a liability, Arthur. She was interfering with a code red. She is a pathetic diversity hire from a state school. I fired her. I had security throw her out. Harris stared at him. The chief executive officer looked like he was going to vomit. He reached out and snatched the bloody yellow sticky note from the nurse's hand. He looked at the perfect, hyperspecific chemical breakdown. He looked at the tiny initial at the bottom. Then he looked down at the king of medicine in the dirt. "You arrogant, blind fool," Harris whispered. His voice was shaking so violently he could barely form the words. "You did not fire a diversity hire. You just physically assaulted our final hope." Vance froze. The entire room stopped breathing. "That was not an intern." Harris shouted, his voice cracking like a whip. "Her name is Professor Myelin. She is the executive director of the World Health Organization's Global Toxicology Institute. She holds 3 doctorates. She wrote the absolute definitive textbook on rare biological neurotoxins that you force your residents to memorize. She did not transfer from a state school. The board of directors brought her here deeply undercover to conduct a blind, rigorous competency assessment of this hospital because our mortality rates have been slipping." The words dropped like a bomb. The silence was deafening. Sterling backed away from the bed, his hands covering his mouth. The nurses stared at the door in absolute shock. Vance knelt on the floor, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. The realization crushed him completely. He remembered the notebook, the thousands of chemical formulas, her flawless diagnosis in the operating room. She was not a ghost. She was a god walking among them. And because she did not wear a Rolex, because her scrubs were faded and her shoes were cheap, he had treated her like an animal. "She came here to evaluate you," Richard Harris said in a cut, terrifying deadpan, "and you made her clean up your coffee. You threw the smartest medical mind on this planet out into a freezing blizzard while your daughter dies on this table." Vance looked at the flatlining monitor. The spring had finally snapped. The universe had delivered its ultimate devastating karma. He had judged a book by its cover, and the price of his arrogance was everything he loved. Vance did not stay on the floor. He scrambled to his feet. He did not ask for his cashmere overcoat. He did not grab his keys. He just ran. He burst through the sliding glass doors of Trauma Room 1, shoving past the stunned chief executive officer. He sprinted down the long fluorescent-lit hallway. His heart hammered against his ribs, not with the steady rhythm of a surgeon, but with the erratic, terrifying beat of a desperate father. He hit the emergency exit doors, with both hands throwing his entire body weight against the heavy metal bars. The doors blew open. The Chicago blizzard hit him like a physical blow. The wind chill was 20 below zero. The air was thick with blinding horizontal snow. Vance was wearing nothing but his thin, sweat-soaked surgical scrubs and his pristine white lab coat. The gold embroidery over his heart. Dr. Richard Vance, chief of surgery, was instantly covered in a layer of freezing ice. He did not feel the cold. He ran out into the empty, snow-covered street. He was slipping on the ice, his expensive Italian leather shoes offering zero traction. He fell hard onto the frozen asphalt, scraping his hands raw. He did not stop. He clawed his way back up and kept running. He looked wildly down the desolate avenue. Then he saw her, half a block down, standing under the flickering yellow light of a frozen bus shelter, was Maya. She was perfectly still. Her thin navy blue nylon windbreaker offered almost no protection against the howling wind. Her hands were shoved deep into her pockets. She was looking down the street, waiting for the city bus to take her far away from this kingdom of arrogance. Maya. Vance screamed her name. His voice was torn away by the wind, completely stripped of its usual authority. It was a raw, primal sound. He ran toward the bus shelter. He tripped on the curb, his knee smashing into the concrete. He did not get back up. He crawled the last few feet through the slush and the snow. The king of medicine. The man who demanded absolute submission from everyone in his presence dragged himself forward until he was right at her feet. Maya looked down. Her expression was completely unreadable. Her dark eyes were cold professional and entirely devoid of pity. She looked at the man who had poured scalding coffee on her cheap canvas sneakers just a few hours ago. Vance grabbed the hem of her faded scrubs with his raw, bleeding hands. "Please," he sobbed. The tears were freezing on his cheeks before they even hit the ground. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving violently under his thin white coat. "Please, I am begging you." He let go of her scrubs and pressed his forehead directly against the freezing, slush-covered concrete of the sidewalk. He completely surrendered his ego. He shattered his own pride. "I was wrong." Vance wept into the dirt. "I was so arrogant. I am so sorry. You can take my job. You can take my medical license. You can ruin my life. But please, Professor, please save my little girl." Maya stood above him. The contrast was absolute. The untouchable surgeon kneeling in the freezing mud, weeping uncontrollably. The faded ghost standing tall, holding the power of life and death in her steady hands. The spring had fully uncoiled. Justice was absolute. Maya did not smile. She did not gloat. She did not deliver a dramatic monologue about karma or respect. She was a scientist, and her patient was dying. "Get up, Richard," she said quietly. Her voice was colder than the blizzard. "We are losing time." Maya walked back into the hospital. She did not walk like an intern. She did not keep her eyes pinned to the floor. She walked with the absolute, undeniable authority of a woman who knew exactly who she was. The heavy electronic sliding glass doors of Trauma Room 1 parted. She stepped inside. She did not wear a pristine white coat. Her faded green scrubs were stained with slush and mud. Her canvas sneakers squeaked on the linoleum, but she commanded the room. The elite doctors, the Ivy League residents, the nurses who had ignored her all morning, they all froze. They looked at her, really looked at her. They saw the blood on her knuckle. They saw the fire in her eyes. Harris, the chief executive officer, stepped back. He gave her a wide berth, completely deferring to her expertise. Maya did not look at Vance. She did not care about the chief of surgery. She walked straight to the center of the chaos. She stopped at the foot of the bed. She looked at the flatlining monitor. She looked at the blue tint on Chloe's skin. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. "Push 300 milligrams of sodium nitrite," Maya ordered. Her voice was not loud. It was not a scream. It was cold steel. Intravenous push. Now. Sterling, the Golden Boy resident, stood frozen, the empty epinephrine syringe still trembling in his hand. "Move," Maya commanded, her eyes snapping to him. Sterling flinched. He dropped the empty syringe. He scrambled. He ripped open a sterile drawer, grabbed the precise vial of sodium nitrite, and began drawing the exact dosage Maya had demanded. His hands shook violently. He pushed the needle into the child's IV line. Now push the sodium thiosulfate. Maya said, her eyes fixed entirely on the monitor. 12.5 grams. Slow drip. Do not rush it. You will shock the system. Establish a secondary line and push pure oxygen. The neurotoxin binds to the cytochrome oxidase. We need to detach it immediately. The nurses moved with military precision, terrified of making a mistake in front of the executive director of the Global Toxicology Institute. They hung the IV bags. They adjusted the drips. The room operated entirely on her command. The arrogance was gone. The hierarchy was shattered. The elite medical minds of Chicago Memorial were reduced to trembling assistants desperately following the orders of the woman they had treated like garbage just hours earlier. Maya stood perfectly still, watching the digital screen. She watched the flat red line. 10 seconds passed. 20 seconds. The silence in the room stretched out thick with a terrible agonizing dread. Vance was standing against the back wall. He looked like a ghost. He was watching his daughter, his life slipping away. Then the monitor beeped. It was a single high-pitched mechanical sound. A jagged spike of green light shattered the horizontal line. It was faint, erratic, but it was there. 30 seconds later, it beeped again. Stronger this time. The jagged green line spiked higher, forming a weak struggling rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The charge nurse whispered, her voice cracking with tears. She is in sinus rhythm. Heart rate 50 and climbing. Blood pressure 60/40. She is stabilizing. The blue tint began to recede from Chloe's cheeks, replaced by a terrifyingly pale but undeniable pink. The massive dose of epinephrine that had almost killed her was being neutralized. The biological neurotoxin was detaching from her heart. The antidote was working. The child was alive. The room exhaled. It was a collective, shuddering breath. The tension shattered. Nurses began to weep silently. Sterling leaned back against the counter, sliding down until he hit the floor, burying his face in his hands. Maya did not celebrate. She did not smile. She simply stepped back from the bed. Her job was done. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her frayed, duct-taped leather notebook, and clicked her cheap plastic pen. She jotted down a final note, her handwriting sharp and precise. She turned toward the sink. She turned the brass faucet. She grabbed a coarse paper towel and wiped the blood off her scraped knuckle. She washed the slush off her hands. She dried them carefully, methodically. She threw the paper towel into the red biohazard bin. She turned around. She faced the room. She faced the elite doctors. She faced the chief executive officer. She faced the untouchable king of medicine who was still trembling against the wall. She did not say a word to him. She just walked out. Maya tossed the damp paper towel into the red biohazard bin. She turned toward the exit. She did not look at the monitoring equipment. She did not look at the elite residents still trembling by the crash cart. And she did not look at Dr. Vance. He was still pressed against the far wall. His pristine white lab coat was stained with slush and mud. His silver hair was disheveled. The king of medicine was broken, waiting for a word of forgiveness or a word of anger. He got neither. Maya walked right past him. The absolute silence of her departure was the ultimate condemnation. She did not care enough about him to even be angry. 3 weeks later, the hierarchy at Chicago Memorial Hospital was entirely dismantled. The massive mahogany table in the surgical lounge was empty. The designer espresso machine sat unused. Dr. Richard Vance was standing in his executive office. He was not wearing his gold-embroidered lab coat. He was wearing a plain gray sweater. He was packing his medical degrees into a cardboard box. The state medical board had moved with terrifying speed, gross negligence, reckless endangerment, insubordination resulting in a near fatality. They stripped him of his medical license. His $2 million insured hands were permanently grounded. He picked up his gold Rolex from the desk, looked at it for a long second, and dropped it into the box. He walked out of the hospital through the loading dock. Nobody held the door for him. Nobody looked at him. Upstairs in the executive wing, the frosted glass door had a new nameplate. It did not have gold embroidery. It was simple, brushed steel. Professor Maya Lin, Chief of Medical Operations. She was sitting at the desk reviewing surgical protocols. She was not wearing faded scrubs anymore, but she still wore her cheap canvas sneakers. She did not demand coffee. She demanded excellence. Arrogance will always force you to pay the highest possible price. You can wear the most expensive suits, and you can demand the respect of everyone in the room. But the moment you decide someone is beneath you, just because of how they look, you have already lost. Do you think the chief of surgery got what he deserved? Let me know in the comments below. And share this story if you believe you should never, ever judge a book by its cover. The clean downloadable script file is ready above for direct paste into your TTS generator. It is fully optimized with natural American pacing, contractions where they flow best, all numbers spelled out, 0 symbols or formatting, and one seamless narrative block, designed for a deep, confident, grounded male voice.